Today we're going to be reviewing the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Now, one of the reasons why I chose to make this a lecture is because our textbook, which is YOB, ends with the election of 1860 and secession, a war for the Union, 1861-1863, a war for emancipation, 1863 to 1865, conclusion, primary sources, reference material. Those are our Civil War sections in YOB. Going to our Reconstruction sections, our sections are the introduction, politics of Reconstruction, the meaning of Black freedom, Reconstruction in women, racial violence in Reconstruction, economic development during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and the end of Reconstruction, conclusion, primary sources, and reference material. I don't want us to miss the greater focus on the 13th Amendment. YOB does a great job of the broader issues, but there is a historical debate that is significant for us to cover in short lecture. Over the 13th Amendment, the people involved and around the 13th Amendment and some of the historical arguments associated with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment reads, they're neither slavery or involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And it is generally taught that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It, at the very least, first thing we talk about is what it did do. It did stop any talks of future succession. That is something that it did mark. It brought the Union together, and it was never an issue after the point of that legislation. So that is important. It also was a legislation that was probably the most important and the most focused on legislation in the Lincoln historiography. Abraham Lincoln is the most written on figure in American history next to Jesus. So that says a lot that this particular legislation is the apex of a figure that has had that much coverage. So when you're talking about the 13th Amendment, we have to find out what does it mean and why is it so historically debated. Unfortunately, a lot of people are not even aware of some of the debates that are associated with the 13th Amendment. The United States and Abraham Lincoln have a history of using language that do not represent everything the situation is going to touch. Now I'm going to explain what I'm saying. The next piece of legislation that Lincoln is most noted for is the EP, the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is a very significant document that says more than what it's communicated in scholarship. The Emancipation Proclamation is taught as though it is a document that freed the slaves, when it strategically freed certain slaves, certain people, not slaves in America. It was the slaves that America needed for its purpose during the war. There was a letter that Abraham Lincoln sent to Horace Greeley, and he explained to Horace Greeley that anything that I do that benefits black people is because it happened to align with what I have to do to benefit the country. And if they benefit from it, so be it. But my focus is on benefiting the country. So when in the Emancipation Proclamation, it stipulates that the slaves ultimately have to free themselves. The Homestead Act in 1862 was another act. The Homestead Act was done during the Civil War, 1862, and it provided that any adult citizen or intended citizen who had never borne arms against the United States government could claim 160 acres of surveyed government land. And that is for them to improve it and, get a leg up in the country, as long as you never fought against the country. Well, what's not necessarily mentioned in that, just like the Emancipation Proclamation didn't quite mention, well, if you are a slave in a state that is not rebelling against the U.S., you're still a slave. So we're not really going against slavery, we're going against the war. Well, here they're saying, yeah, we'll give you all this land, even if you're not a citizen of this country. But it doesn't quite mention that it's 500 native nations occupying this land, which means the further genocide of the Native American communities. And that is the lesson that is generally not taught along with the Homestead Act. Let's go back to the Emancipation Proclamation, though. One of the popular criticisms of the EP was the fact that Lincoln had no power to assert authority over slaves in the Confederacy. A lesser discussed criticism of the legislation was the latent requirements of the slaves to free themselves, where it says efforts they make for their actual freedom. So the EP is pretty long, but there's always a part of sincerity in the document that does not translate into education, or communication, or publication. And the same thing applies with the 13th Amendment. But even when we go to the 14th Amendment, this is not an Abraham Lincoln thing, because it's Abraham Lincoln and the United States. The 14th Amendment was drafted and passed at the height of convict leasing. And you will learn more about convict leasing in Lesson 2, which is Douglas Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name, which began immediately after the 13th Amendment was passed. The 14th Amendment stated, in sum, equal protection under the law, specifically named black people or people of African descent. Again, we all now know, and it is probably no surprise understanding the history of the time and subsequent. Black people did not get equal rights, so to speak, until 1964, which was almost 100 years later. So we have legislation on the books in 1868, the 14th Amendment, saying equal protection under law. Well, we know convict leasing. We know Plessy versus Ferguson happened, separate but equal. We know that Jim Crow happened. We know the Civil Rights Movement happened. We know war on drugs with Nixon happened. We know the war on drugs with Ronald Reagan happened. We know the 1994 crime bill happened. We know that mass incarceration is still happening. So there were the equal protection under the law. At the very least, we know we have about 100 years of a law that was written that had some type of loophole. So let's go back to the 13th Amendment. We know that the Emancipation Proclamation had the loophole of the efforts they make for their actual freedom. That's the loophole in the EP. Now we go to the 14th Amendment. We'll jump over to the 13th Amendment. We know that the exceptions clause, which is except if punishable by beg pardon. Of course, I would sneeze during the lecture. Sorry. Except if it's punishable by crime, you can be a slave. It did not say you can be rehabilitated. It did not say you can be removed from society yet retain your rights as a citizen. It said you can be a slave. That's what except means. So, again, we have Emancipation Proclamation, the efforts you make to free yourself. You have the obviously unapplicated 14th Amendment that said there would be equal protection under the law specifically for the freed people of African American descent. And now we have the 13th Amendment that's telling us you can be a slave, actually. So we talked about what the 13th Amendment did do. It stopped the succession. It ended the Civil War. But it did not abolish slavery. It changed slavery. It did abolish chattel slavery. But that is a very fine distinction, as to say it changed something as to where something is no longer there. With its first century, the United States became a world power because of economics. And slavery was the United States business model that economically allowed that. All right. So because we're getting into why are these loopholes there? Is this about bad people? No. One thing, I really like Abraham Lincoln. I think he was very honest. And so the honest Abe does hold. If you look at what he always said, and you look at what he always did, and you look at what he wrote, he may have been very savvy in how he did it, but he never misrepresented what he was doing. I haven't found any documentation to show him being inconsistent, except for when he alluded to black people having the right to vote. That seemed to be kind of outside of his general area from the time he was a politician to his assassination. But within the Western Hemisphere, the United States had the most severe form of chattel slavery. And that was whereas chattel slavery was inherited. You had no rights over your own labor or your children's labor. You had no right to marriage. You had no right to bear arms. You had no right to own land. You were property, as a chair or cattle or something like that. That control created a model of, if you have one government that has to, or every other government around the world that has a labor-based system, people are being paid to do the labor. The United States created a system that has the same business model without the labor expense, which is how in less than 100 years, the United States became a world economic power. It is a economic miracle that happened, but it's just simple mathematics. That if I don't have the labor costs you have, I'm going to be able to sell at better prices. I'm going to be able to produce more because I don't have labor rules. I don't have workday limitations. I don't have the types of restrictions that other businesses / governments are going to have. So that being said, that is why it is significant that this labor be still available to the American model. No matter how it changes, it has to be present. So that's why we're looking at, why is this 13th Amendment one of the most important legislative documents in the world? Because, in United States history, because every mention from 1960 to 1965 of Abraham Lincoln's intentions was always to save the nation. And that is what the 13th Amendment did. In fact, in his letter to Horace Greeley, he was saying, I'm just trying to get the United States back to how it was. So what he's talking about is the stability of the United States. So he knew, he's always spoke that he was never in favor of immediate emancipation because he knew that would cause too much hardship. So what he wanted to do was put forth a mechanism that would make sure the United States was together first. And he had to have a provision that labor would be free labor. The business model would be maintained. The immediate transformation of slavery occurred within the same year of the 13th Amendment. Convict leasing. Frederick Douglass described the slave's freedom granted by the 13th Amendment as this. They were free to hunger. They were free to the winds and rains of heaven, free to the pitiless wrath of enraged masters' hands. They were free without rules to cover them or land to cultivate. As a consequence, dies in such numbers as to awaken the hope of their enemies that they would soon disappear. We gave them freedom and famine at the same time. These 7 million people were just let loose. And they were not given the land promised as the Homestead Act was. You didn't even have to be a citizen. You just planned to be a citizen, you could get land. There was no financial floor that was offered to any of the other citizens. So these people being released created an opportunity for laws to be formed to put them back into the system of slavery, because if loitering was illegal against the law, you could be arrested for it. And if you're arrested for it, you go to jail. If the jails don't have enough room to take care of the 7 million people that's just been released into the street, because if I'm released in the street, I don't have a home, I don't have land, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to loiter. If my kids are hungry, or I'm hungry enough, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to steal. Well, when that occurs, guess what I get to do? You broke the law. Now I have to send you back. But now you can be a slave. It's legal. But it's not the same thing. That's what the 13th Amendment's exceptions clause is. Now, in our reading and in our videos, we'll see that there are many figures that are playing part in this. Frederick Douglass being one of them, and one of his mentors was William Lloyd Garrison, his mentor at one time. So there are a lot of dynamics that played a part into the 13th Amendment. Many of the abolitionists did not want black people to be equal. Everybody were not pure egalitarians. Some people felt, the slavery part is not right, but I want to maintain the advantage of this being a white man's country, or I want to make sure I have my access, or I don't necessarily want to live around these people. And William Lloyd Garrison was one of them. William Lloyd Garrison was a strong abolitionist. And once the 13th Amendment stopped chattel slavery, he was like, fine, we can disband. We're done. We did what we were supposed to do. Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, is saying, wait, no. We have to continue to right this wrong, because even now, this society was like this. Okay, I've been freed, but I've been given no access to anything. So I'm still down here. You're still up here. The society is going to continue to move forward like this. He said, let's get it up here, and then we're good. That's Frederick Douglass. William Lloyd Garrison said, no, I'm supposed to be up here. It was just wrong for you to be forced to stay up here. Now, if in some way you can get higher, that's on you. And so there were many levels to abolition thought. Even in Lincoln himself, he wasn't a fan of slavery. His father had leased him out for work when he was young, and he would have to give his father all the money, and he did not like that. So he was very opposed to slavery, but not akin to the African or African American experience at all. He was known to use the word nigger. He was known to be very distant with the plight of black people. It is probably not odd that convict leasing began immediately after the 13th Amendment. Was it planned? We don't know. 100% answer. It would be odd if it wasn't. But uh, it provided prisoners laborers to the same plantations that they were freed from. So it was just another mode of maintaining the status quo, which was Lincoln's number one priority. Being an advocate of compensated emancipation, Lincoln was keenly aware of the financial and social impact freeing slaves would have on northern and southern whites. In March of 1862, Lincoln drafted a resolution endorsing compensated emancipation in all of the border states that was received unfavorable. His 13th Amendment allowed slavery to continue under the control conditions of lawmakers instead of the private sector. So now we've been moved from the people who are making decisions about slavery now the lawmakers as opposed to the private sector. That's really what happened with the 13th Amendment. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union. Abraham Lincoln quote. I believe that is directly from that letter from Horace Greeley. The 13th Amendment is drafted as a perfect negotiation in the interest of addressing the economic debate surrounding slavery and maintain the requisite pool of free labor the country was built on. Convict leasing, in many instances, had practices worse than chattel slavery. As purchased items, slave owners had an interest in maximizing their investment. So the longer your slave lived, the longer you got work. But if you're just renting some, it's the difference between buying a car and renting a car. Rental cars get beat up because people know it's going back, whatever. Buy a car, I'm going to have to take care of this car for a while. So when you look at the videos, I want you to look at how different the two videos are. One is given from a slavery being changed perspective. Another is being given from slavery being abolished. And I just want you to notice the difference in tone and the difference in thought and see what you pull out of it.